My name is Chris Bayliss, I'm Director of Standards, and I'm joined today by Chinelo Etiaba, our Membership Director.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. It's good to be here to introduce the new terms of reference for the working groups, and we hope that you find the session as interactive and as helpful as we would like it to be. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Chinelo. So yeah, I think we probably will open it up, but for now, use the Q&A and we'll see how it goes. So before I start on the terms of reference and the kind of the formalities of the working groups today, I think it's probably worthwhile doing a bit of history with these working groups and looking at how they have worked in the past, and maybe some of the things we've learned from that and what we want to work with the working groups going forward in the future. And we've had working groups for a long time with ASI, and they have tended to be quite localized and expert in their focus, and they've really been a way of gathering knowledge and of testing ideas, really, to enable us to develop good standards and also to learn from implementation processes as well. And so from the very early days, working groups within ASI had a role to do some work, to actually do the work. And that was quite focused, quite localized, as I say, for some issues. So some issues, very narrow, required deep expertise, domain knowledge, something that we needed to access from our membership and even from beyond our membership. But there were other working groups that formed that were much broader, climate change, greenhouse gas related ones, where there's a whole range of issues related to mitigation, adaptation, inventory building, scope 3 type emissions, very broad, vast subject matter. And what we've found over the years is a couple of things. One is that the working groups tended, once they were formed, to stay formed. They were almost like standing groups. And so that was all good for the big, broad subjects, but for the expert discussions, wasn't necessarily the best outcome. The other thing was, I think, that we missed some areas of focus. So you will note that previously we didn't really have a working group based on non-greenhouse gas emissions. So we kind of lacked those areas. And one of the things we wanted to do in this process is ensure that we were covering all the bases, that we were able to build working groups to do work that that really covered off all of the issues under ASI, under its ESG standards, and also ones we hadn't even thought about yet. So that's the first thing to say, is that in this reformulation of the working groups, we wanted to ensure that we got access to good knowledge, good expertise across the membership and beyond when necessary, across the whole suite of issues. The other thing we found is that people they liked working on working groups, and you would tend to find some people who were very motivated and very active, and others who were less motivated and were in there occasionally for their own ends or just to kind of give input on specific issues. And what we found was there's quite a lot of frustration, I think, among those who put in a lot of time and effort, that when they were coming up with outcomes of the work, it wasn't necessarily feeding into, or certainly wasn't being necessarily picked up by the decision makers within ASI. And for us, the decision making body on standards is our standards committee. So we wanted to be able to kind of formalize a little bit that relationship between the standards committee and the working group in order to maximize the benefit, the value of the output of working groups, and to ensure that the working groups weren't just a kind of a talking shop that delivered something to the standards committee that the standards committee either A, didn't want, or B, didn't pick up and run with. But I'll temper that by saying that we also recognize, and we've heard it from our membership, that these working groups, and indeed the forums of ASI, including the 45 minutes on and the other work that we do, is highly valued by the membership. That ability to talk to peers in the sector, or to talk to other players in the value chain, is really beneficial and really valuable for them. So what we've tried to do in this reformulation of the terms of reference, and I'll talk a bit about the specifics in a moment, is to try and meet those two aims. On the one hand, to provide meaningful input to standards development that's very focused on the standards and the standards committee's decision making, but at the same time give room for members and others to talk about wider issues or very specific issues that they might have in the value chain, which I have to say has an indirect benefit on the standards because it gives us insight onto some emerging issues. So it's let's say it's my early warning system for issues that might eventually form part of the standard or might need to be tackled through the performance and the chain of custody standard. So that's a bit of background. It's also why we have limited the number of working groups. So we have limited capacity, limited resources within the Secretariat, and with lots and lots of working groups, many of whom want to be standing groups, that's very difficult to manage. And so we decided that we would we'd make these working groups a bit larger, and we would structure them in such a way that they fitted within the sustainability priorities of ASI. And so the working groups we have now, I think, are probably much broader. They're similar to the old greenhouse gas one that we had, very big, but they cover all of the bases. Those four priority areas are circularity, climate change, human rights, and nature positive. And I'll talk about the specifics of some of those groups in a moment. They're in addition to a fifth working group that we have, which is a more procedural, less sustainability issue specific working group, which is the standards benchmarking and harmonization working group, which works to ensure harmonization with other standards. It works on behalf of the standards committee, or works for the standards committee, to identify other standards with which we might want to have some mutual recognition, but also identifies where there's leading practice in other standards, and identifies where we might be able to, within ASI, push towards those leading practices, and the other direction as well, to ensure that our material is in those standards too. It has an important role for our members who don't want to be doing the same piece of work many times. So mutual recognition is important, but I would maybe just final thing for the standards benchmarking group is to say that the high quality of our assurance process is a kind of a red line for us. So what we're finding with many of these other standards bodies is that their assurance process is not quite as robust as ours. And so that can be quite difficult to harmonize when you're a leader. So let's get to these working groups. And one of the things that, so in general, what we would like to do is, as I say, we want to have input to the standards development process and the guidance development process. I don't know if people are aware, but we will be updating the guidance for the performance standard and the chain of custody much more frequently than we used to do. So previously we would update standards, normative language, and guidance on a kind of 3 to 5 year periodicity, which is aligned with our ISEAL code compliance. And we'll continue to do that for normative language. So there's kind of a long term between revisions of the normative language. But we're going to a model where we're revising guidance much more frequently to respond to issues identified during certification and implementation, and also the very fast moving discussions on things like climate and biodiversity, which will necessitate change in the guidance much more frequently. So one of the jobs of the working groups is to facilitate or have input to that guidance development and eventually to the standards development as well. And there were some issues that have hung over us from the last revision period that we're addressing now, the standards committee is addressing now. And we can expect that where the standards committee doesn't have a position, or where the standards committee needs some expert input, it's to the working groups it will go for some guidance. It's worthwhile saying here, and to repeat maybe what I said earlier, which is that the working groups do not have a decision-making role within ASI. They are a source of expertise, a source of information from different points in the value chain, but are not decision makers. Ultimately, the standards committee makes recommendations to the board, which is the ultimate decision making body within ASI, but it's the standards committee that tasks the working groups with these pieces of work. So I've actually had quite a lot of emails recently from people saying, we see these working groups coming, has the work started yet? And the truth is that there is not yet a work plan from the standards committee to those working groups to allow that work to begin. But I would say in the next 2 months or so, you will start to see that happen, and I'll talk about what those areas might be in a moment. It is to the standards committee that these working groups will give their input, and it's from the standards committee that we'll hear the questions that need to be answered. So let's move on to what they, who's in them. Before, I think we had quite a loose membership of the working groups. They tended to be open to all. They weren't just limited to ASI members. And what we've tried to do, given that they are of such value to the membership, is we are tightening up the membership for working groups to ASI members predominantly, to Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum members and networks as well. And it's important to say at this stage that IPAF, Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, input is woven through all of these working groups. So it's not on its own, it's actually part of the discussions of all of the working groups. Open to the ASI Secretariat to enable us to gather the information we need to send to the Standards Committee or to others. And also to Secretariat invited experts. We know that there is knowledge and expertise from outside of the membership, and that will be invited in on an as needed basis. We will maintain attendance and participation records of those working groups. We won't be publishing individual participants, so we won't be sharing those publicly. A couple of questions that have come in from people I know in recent weeks. Members are entitled to join one, all, as many working groups as you like. So there's not a limitation on joining the working groups. In fact, I would encourage all of our members to play a role in all of the working groups. I understand that time is limited, but they also form a kind of a way of us communicating with you as well. So I'd encourage, if not active participation, then kind of passive participation in all. We also know that we want to access your knowledge, access your expertise, right? So we know that that doesn't lie with one person in companies. So sometimes you, at a corporate perspective, may want to control that information, and that's fine. If it's one person on all the working groups, that's fine by us. But if you see a need or a desire to have multiple representatives on working groups, that is fine too. It's not a decision-making body. There is no voting. It's a working group of experts. So multiple representatives is fine by us. In terms of time commitment, that is entirely up to you. I mean, the Standards Committee wants to maximize the expertise, and this is why I'd say these are not standing working groups. They're not kind of standing committees that will have a known regular set of meetings. They will be working on specific issues as generated by the Standards Committee. And I would foresee something like once a quarter for discussions, but it may be more frequent where there are very specific issues. It may be further apart if there are not. I also mentioned earlier this role that the working groups play in peer-to-peer relationships and in gaining value to you, the members. And there's certainly opportunity for that. I want to hear about that today, actually, is if you have a desire, what I want is good stuff coming into the Standards Committee. You may want something different, and we can certainly facilitate that, but we'd need to prioritize those kinds of discussions given the limited resources we have. Francis, yes, absolutely there is that way to feed recommendations up. I'll tell you my issue there is that I don't yet have a process for that to kind of happen. What I don't want to happen is for me and us, once a month to come together with a working group just to have a chat and for that information to somehow be fed up. We need some way of structuring these working group discussions, seeding them with a kind of I guess a common knowledge, and then feeding something back. So I don't think it's enough that we just open the floor and say this is a working group, say as you will. But we're working on that. So I would say we don't have a process yet, but I do think, well, we will be developing that kind of process to do that. Having said that, we're always open for input, right? So we are also working on a kind of a feedback process more generally, but always issues can be raised with us, and that's how I would see us controlling it. Issues raised with us, we build an agenda for the working groups raised around those issues. Example might be recycled content quantification across multiple segments, something like that. And that is the basis for the working group discussions. What I'm trying to avoid in all of this is lots of open discussions without a way of a process to somehow capture that information with our limited resources. So maybe to go quickly through some of the working groups areas of focus. The circularity working group really is based on 3 principles driven by kind of circular economy design. One, to eliminate waste and pollution, both during production processes, but also during use phase and end of life, so across the full value chain. The circulation of products and materials at their highest value, so issues around not only end of life scrap recovery, but also the quality of scrap going into the systems by design. And then the regeneration of nature, and here there's a real close linkage between this working group and the nature positive working group. And I should say separately that these working groups will not work in silos. So there will be cross-fertilization between these different groups that we will need to manage. In terms of what might happen over the next 6 months within this group, well, we are looking at further development of our performance standard principle 4 on materials stewardship. And I would expect discussions to start on that relatively soon, the next 6 to 8 months, with an eye to revision of normative language in 2027. It sounds a long way off. But we want to start these discussions now around things like life cycle assessment, design for recycling, recycled content, in order to be ready for that revision in 5 years' time. The Standards Committee last week, and you'll see this in future minutes, made a decision that we would start to explore outcomes-based criteria in addition to our existing practice-based criteria. So this is a departure for ASI. It was kind of a shift towards a model which allows us to articulate where ASI is actually affecting change. So through that increased recovery of end-of-life material, decreasing generation of bauxite residue and recirculation of that material, etc. So we can expect this working group, and in fact there'll be a paper out probably January time for the circularity working group, and indeed all of the working groups, looking at potential outcomes-based indicators and asking working groups to explore what some kind of priority first level outcomes-based criteria might be. So that's certainly on the agenda. More broadly, discussions around improving post-consumer scrap collection, as I've said, and quality, product and service related footprints. Certainly product footprints is a key issue. It was raised during the last standards revision process. There's some optional numbers in the chain of custody, principle 9 documentation, that I think will be hardened up in future versions, things like carbon footprint, recycled content. Yes, so as I say, this explicit linkage with nature positive, but also the climate working group as well. Climate change working group, I think, is probably the one that we get the most questions about. It is probably the one that is the most mature in terms of the questions that the Standards Committee will be asking of it. And the big question right now, as it has been for the last 6 months, is what is an ASI endorsed 1.5 degree entity level pathway? And that really is the biggest question that this working group will grapple with in order to make a recommendation to the Standards Committee in Q3 next year. Reason I say that is there's a lot of initiatives around right now that are developing entity type pathways through Rocky Mountain Institute, Centre for Climate Aligned Finance, Horizon Zero, First Movers Coalition, Mission Possible Partnership, etc., etc. We want to wait for the outcomes of those initiatives before we begin discussions. And I would expect that we would also need to have better insight on transparency around recycled content and the environmental burden of scrap as well. So we will be waiting for the outputs of those processes in Q2, and then expect the working group to be working on, I think, endorsement of some kind of pathway in Q3. I don't think that someone else will come up with that pathway, so I think we're going to have to do it. So there's definitely work for that working group into the middle of next year. In the meantime, what we'll do is we will be sharing all the materials that comes out of those different initiatives and priming this working group to begin to make recommendations to the Standards Committee. There'll be difficult discussions and challenging ones as well. There's lots more on the greenhouse gas side, but that's my focus for the next year as well. You may have other ideas, maybe Scope 3 accounting, these kind of things as well. I'm really keen to hear those, and also how we might facilitate those discussions in the working group without burdening the Secretariat and others with a whole heap of work to meet members' corporate needs, given that we're really focused on this standards, this entity level pathway built into the standards. On the human rights working group, actually the human rights working group has been going for some years now. We can expect further work around refinement and potential additions to principles 9, 10 and 11, the social principles, but also supply chain due diligence. And I expect human rights due diligence associated with non-aluminium inputs to the aluminium value chain. An example of that is alloying elements and the need for responsible sourcing policies to cover those alloying elements as well. So we are looking in the new year at probably start with a 45-minute webinar on some of the risks associated with those non-aluminium inputs to the chain to kick off some of those discussions as well. Or more broadly, the conventional discussions on just transition is extremely important, and the linkage to climate change working groups work as well. Also, the interaction of our standards with regulatory developments. We're involved with the CBAM European regulation, the kind of technical input to that that work in the EU. We can expect further regulatory developments in things like human rights due diligence in EU as well. Finally, the nature positive working group, and here I think you can expect an email from me actually in the next couple of hours, which is to kick that work off that working group off with a kind of a 101 on the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and the development of their framework, which is currently underway, and what kind of input ASI and its members might have in that framework development, with an eye to potentially feeding that back into the standard at a later date. So that working group will kick off in the next few weeks. I expect the first week in December we'll have the first meeting of that group, which will be a kind of a making sure everyone is on the same page with respect to those developments. More broadly, the Nature Positive Working Group will be taking the outputs of the Convention for Biological Diversity COP meeting, which is in December, and seeing how they can feed into the biodiversity criteria, but also guidance as well for those who were on yesterday's 45 minutes on critical ecosystem areas. That's a case in point. One of the feedbacks that we got, I think, from broadly, especially from some civil society members with the publication of the last standard, was that the greenhouse gas criteria were kind of progressive and were ambitious, albeit we didn't yet have a method. So it prioritized ambition over the existence of a method for entity level pathways. But that the feeling was that the biodiversity ecosystem services criteria were perhaps less ambitious than they could be. And I think post the COP meeting, on CBD, we would expect to see a bit more. See a bit more how we can develop those criteria. Having said that, the Nature Positive Working Group is not only about biodiversity and ecosystem services, it's also about the role that nature positive changes can play in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I think on the adaptation side of things, it was an area of increasing focus. So we'll see some discussions there. In the short term, though, TNFD is the main focus. So maybe I've come across, and I maybe did it on purpose, a little bit selfish in what I want and what the Standards Committee want and need from the working groups. Chinello is also on the line with maybe a different view on how we service our members' needs, and that's our job, mine, Chinello's, is to balance this need for you as members to be part of these discussions and to get you to do business better, but also to feed into our standards development process and make our standards better as well. So I'm very keen to hear from you, either through Q&A, or I think we have such a small crowd here today, what, 13 attendees, that we could even open it up to the floor as well. But before doing that, Chinello, is there anything you'd like to add or to challenge me on a bit, which I'm more than happy to be challenged on?
No, not at all. I think what we want is to deliver value for the membership, and then this covers it, because I think if we produce a standard that makes sense, then it delivers value to the members that have to implement those standards. And I think to Francis' question about a system to be able to feed stuff back, I think that whole 1,500 days of consultation is part of this process, because we do want members to engage. We do want to hear from you. And I guess if we look at the kind of the support framework that we have going, the fact that everybody's email is available for you to communicate with us, you can reach out to Chris, you can reach out to myself or other members of the team. There's that expert team within the secretariat that can actually bubble up those issues from either individuals or from the working groups to the standards committee, or even into the secretariat to talk about it and then, I guess, create an agenda of sorts. So I think what we want from a membership point of view is to make members understand that they are heard. You raise your issues, we grapple with them, and then we reach a solution of integrity for all parties concerned. So that's it from me, I guess.
Thanks, Chinello. There was a question actually yesterday on the critical ecosystem areas. It's not from a member, or it might have been. It was anonymous, but I think it wasn't. I think I know who it was. And the question was, why didn't you consider critical habitats in your biological biodiversity ecosystem services? Where's critical habitats in this? No one raised it. So what? We had thousands of comments come in, albeit they were probably from the same 60 people. So we want to reach a bigger cohort and get those questions before, not 4 months after. So absolutely, those kind of horizon issues are extremely important. And especially I don't know if there's a question that came in around the small business representation, but I saw your answer on the chat around small business SME representation. Here's my honest opinion. The early forms of the performance standard were really focused on the upstream bit of the industry, because that's where the risks lay. And we know as smaller entities begin to certify that the standards in their current form, the guidance, needs to be adapted and needs to evolve with this changing membership as well. So that's really important that we get that input and we get that understanding of a broader range of the value chain, not just a narrow kind of primary focus. Any questions from folks? I can say.
No.
I can suggest if you want to go through with the opening up the floor.
So the only thing with opening up the floor is then everyone's quiet anyway, but we can just see their faces. But
I could ask if somebody wants to take the floor, have the floor, then they could put up their hand, and then I could allow them to speak. We have one. I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, it's Chester.
Hi, Chester.
Hope you can hear me. We're an ASI member. Yeah, I just thought it might be interesting to hear an indication of, and I know this sounds like it'll be very much based on what the priorities are and when the groups start, but just to get an idea of maybe the frequency of meetings and or like time commitments of joining a working group, perhaps with some idea of, you know, if you're a passive member, what would the time commitment look like in terms of attending meetings, and then if you were a more active member, perhaps with sub-working groups, I don't know if that's part of the working group system already, what that might look like. Just any colour or detail on time commitment might be helpful to understand.
Sure thing. Maybe to answer your last point first about the subgroups. The naming is a right pain, right? So these are working groups and they cover these big issues. So they're kind of almost bigger than working groups. We are looking to identify very focused expert groups with really specific knowledge. So the kind of highly technical. But we're not naming those today because I don't want them to be I don't want them to take over the discussion. This is about you having as much access as you want to ASI and having the best input. So yes, those kind of subgroups or expert groups are things that we would manage on an ad hoc basis. On the working groups, let me give you an example. I think that if we took the climate working group, what you will find is that there would be material shared, which would be reading material that would be both generated by us, but also from third parties, these various initiatives that are going on in Q1, Q2 of next year. Let's say something like 2 hours a month of reading. I mean, I'm plucking that out of the air. But by the time you get to Q3 and we bring all of these different elements together, the primary pathway, the recycling pathway, the post-cast house mix of pre-consumer, post-consumer and aluminium scrap, and then a negotiation. I imagine that at that point, middle of next year, we will be having climate change working group meetings possibly once a week for a couple of months. And they will be about an hour each. That's my guess. Because that issue is so important and so called for that you're going to see a real acceleration in what you need to do in the middle of next year. And there'll be reading associated with that and various one-to-one calls as well. You could be actively involved in that as much as you want, or passively as little as you want as well. Climate change, I think that's the kind of peak involvement that there would be. I think a rule of thumb roughly for the working groups generally is probably something like once a quarter for each. Our standards committee meets currently between 4 to 8 weeks annually. 4 to 8 weeks across the year. Working groups, I think, is probably quarterly. I can't really give you much more indication than that, other than it's based on the amount of work there is to do. There's a lot of work, but also we have to prioritize and those kind of things too. So if you're looking at climate, middle of next year, real peak. If you're looking at nature positive right now, I think input to the TNFD framework is for the next, I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm going to say like the next 9 months, and maybe I would expect that we'd have something for nature positive on that every 4 weeks, just to ensure that we're kind of delivering what's needed into that framework as well. 1 hour call, not more than that. In fact, to be honest, I'd rather limit it to 45 minutes, but it depends on how many people we have as well.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hannah, welcome. Hannah's, I don't know if everyone can see this, but Hannah's saying that she currently works as a graduate environmental specialist at a primary aluminium smelter. She'd like to join these working groups to learn. And here's my approach to that, is that when you're on the working groups, I think you bring a personal perspective, but also given that it's the member representation, you also bring your members' expertise, and it's not decision making, so it's not a corporate position, but you also bring your members in. And I would say that as long as your company is happy with that, then I'm more than happy with that, because your involvement in these working groups allows you then to feed back information to the corporate as well. So I'm more than happy for people to be on calls and listen, and for us to get a diversity of opinion. So I would also encourage you to get engaged in the discussions as well, and let us know how it reflects the reality in your pot rooms, or in your cast house, or in your anode, your rodding shop. That's the kind of input that we want and often lack when you kind of go, higher up into the standards development space. I temper that as well by saying that these working groups are not the only route to that. So ASI also has a quite well developed educational program as well, a training program that's open source, so anyone can access that information. We run these 45 minutes on pretty regularly as well, and we have a broader communications and I guess information sharing space too. What might be nice, Hanno, is I'm inherently, I shouldn't say this, inherently I'm a little bit lazy. So I want to make everything as efficient as possible, right? I don't want to have to manage it all. I don't want to have to spoon feed. I want to build systems that can benefit our members and get me what the standards committee need. And that means that if you and your peers and others within ASI membership want to make some of these things happen, peer-to-peer discussions, or smelters talking to smelters or others, we could kind of facilitate that while being quite hands-off. We don't have to do lots of agendas and lots of prep material. I think we are absolutely open to facilitating these kinds of discussions, particularly among a younger or kind of graduate cohort who really are going to be the future for the industry as well. So I think that's a separate discussion from the working group discussion, but you might want to get in touch on that as well. I'm really happy and want to make space for those discussions to take place. I'm not really lazy, but I kind of am. Anyone else? We have a few more minutes to go. Francis.
Yeah, hi. It's just more on the kind of the logistics, really. Is there a kind of an ASI secretariat member that's scheduling, developing the agenda with the members, etc.? Yeah, so a kind of coordination lead, I guess.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it's me and Chinello, right?
Okay.
So I think previously what we had was the burden was shared within the secretariat on issue specifics, and that will happen eventually. So Chinello, I can't do it all. We are going to be putting members of staff, I think, as kind of, thematic leads in these various groups. So you'll find human rights expertise from within the secretariat should be the kind of thematic contact for the human rights working group. But in terms of logistics and in terms of the kind of oversight, it's Chinello and me. And maybe Chinello, I would say, my role is to kind of ensure that this information gets back to the standards committee and that the standards committee is getting the most out of the working groups, and Chinello's role is to ensure that you are getting what you need and maximizes the value to you as well. So I don't know if two people count, but it's us two.
Great, thanks.
Chris, there's another question: how to address the issue that we want to discuss within the working group. I think that was probably answered previously.
You got 3 minutes of my time. What's your issue? That's the way in, right? Is to let us know. If you've got a specific question, that can go into the working group with some background material as well, and a way to bring others up to speed in order for the working group to work on that issue. Then that kind of thing, that doesn't have to go to the standards committee, right? Unless it has active input to the standard itself. If there are issues that you see that ASI can facilitate through its full value chain representation, bring it to the working group via us at the secretariat, and let's have those discussions. But I need to know what the issues are, and also we're not experts on everything either, so we also need you to be developing some of the background to this, articulating that to your peers, and then facilitating those discussions.
Okay, the final
Or have we lost Chinelo?
Myself or to Chris? Oh.
Hello, sorry,
okay.
we lost you.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to answer the last question. My internet is unstable. Do you want to just take that in case I drop off again?
Yeah, sure. There will be information on the ASI newsletters when those working groups are ready to start. I would say they are ready to start now. I get your name on that list. We have sent a couple of notes out about that. We'll do that again in the future too. And then there will be working group specific mailings as well. You can expect newsletters to address their audiences, i.e. the members or public newsletters. But then we'll also have some working group mail shots as well. So as I say, this afternoon or early tomorrow, I'll be doing one to the Nature Positive working group. So if your name is on the Nature Positive working group, you will get that email. If it's not, let us know. We'll put you on the working group. Okay. With that, I hope this was useful. I know there's still some kind of uncertainty in there as well, but I think we've clarified on what we need from the working groups. And also I hope you have heard that we also want to be maximizing value to you as well. And we're ready to do that. We need to hear from you what your issues are in order for us to be able to address those as well. So feel free to use the contacts at the Secretariat, these kind of sessions, to ask those questions. Chinelo, anything to add?
No, that's it. Thank you so much, guys, for joining. And like Chris said, we're here just on the other end of a phone or email. And we're here to just make sure that you have what you need to continue this certification journey and then bring positive impact to the value chain. So thank you for your time.